The desert may look silent, endless, and empty, but that's what makes it so terrifying. Beneath the scorching sun and the freezing nights, countless stories of horror are buried in the sands, stories of people who vanished without a trace, of voices that whisper in the wind, and of ancient ruins cursed by something not meant to be disturbed. Tonight, we're diving into 3 very scary true desert horror stories that will make you think twice before ever stepping into the wasteland. The desert road stretched endlessly, a ribbon of cracked asphalt swallowed by the vast emptiness on either side. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the crunch of tires rolling over gravel as Daniel drove deeper into the wasteland. His car's headlights cut through the rising dusk, but the further he went, the more the road seemed to disappear into shadows. There were no signboards, no gas stations, no trace of life. Just the barren desert stretching to the horizon. Hours passed, and fatigue began to sink in, making his vision blur and his mind wander. That was when he noticed something strange on the side of the road, a lone figure standing perfectly still in the fading light. The man was dressed like a nomad, his robe flapping slightly in the dry wind, but what unsettled Daniel was the way he stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for him. He slowed the car instinctively, the figure illuminated fully in his headlights. The stranger's face was shadowed beneath a hood, but Daniel felt an unnatural weight in the air. Sensation of being watched by something far older than the desert itself, and his hands tightened on the steering wheel. Daniel's curiosity got the better of him, and against his own judgment, he stopped the car a few feet away from the stranger. The night air was cold, far colder than it should have been in the desert, and an uneasy stillness settled around him. The figure moved slowly toward the car, his footsteps almost soundless on the sand. When he reached the edge of the headlights, Daniel finally saw his face, though it was not what he expected. The man's skin looked parched, cracked like dry earth, and his eyes seemed to glow faintly, reflecting the beams in a way no human eyes should. Without speaking, the stranger gestured toward the horizon, where in the darkness a faint orange glow flickered, as if from a campfire deep in the dunes. Against his instincts, Daniel felt compelled to follow. The stranger began walking, and Daniel, without fully understanding why, turned the car to trail behind him. The silence was broken only by the howl of the desert wind, and the deeper they went, the more Daniel felt the road vanishing behind him. It was as if he had left the world he knew and entered a place where time itself was different. The flickering glow grew stronger as Daniel drove deeper into the desert, the stranger walking ahead as if the sand offered him no resistance. Soon the outlines of a small tent appeared, pitched in the middle of nowhere with no sign of a vehicle or supplies that could have brought it there. The fabric flapped gently in the cold night wind, though the fire beside it burned steady, casting long shadows across the dunes. Daniel parked the car and stepped out, his boots sinking into the sand, the crunch of each step loud in the vast silence. The stranger disappeared into the tent without a word, leaving Daniel standing by the fire that crackled without wood, as if fueled by something unseen. A chill swept over him, not from the cold but from the way the flames bent unnaturally, curling toward him as though reaching for his presence. He wanted to call out, but his throat tightened, his voice trapped. Gathering his courage, he pulled aside the flap and stepped inside, only to find the tent empty. No stranger, no belongings, only the echo of his own breathing bouncing off the thin canvas as if the space were much larger than it appeared inside the tent. The air was heavy, thick with a strange scent that reminded Daniel of burnt metal mixed with damp earth. The space seemed to stretch unnaturally, larger than what he had seen from the outside, its corners swallowed in shadows that moved as if alive. His footsteps echoed faintly, though the ground beneath him was nothing but sand. Then, out of the silence, came a low murmur, words spoken in a language he couldn't recognize, rolling through the air like a chant. Daniel spun around, expecting to see the stranger, but the tent was empty. The murmur grew louder, echoing from every direction until it pressed against his skull, forcing his heartbeat to quicken. He backed toward the flap, but when he pulled it aside, the desert was gone. Instead, a vast expanse of dunes stretched into darkness under a sky filled with swirling red clouds. The fire still burned outside, though now it was much larger, rising like a pillar. Shadows danced around it, human-like figures shifting in and out of sight, their forms stretching and twisting with the flames. Daniel's breath caught as he realized he had stepped into a place that wasn't bound by the world. He knew Daniel stood frozen, his body unwilling to move as the shadowy figures circled the towering fire. Their shapes flickered like smoke, dissolving and reforming, sometimes appearing almost human, other times stretching into monstrous outlines that bent and snapped against the glow. A deep hum vibrated in the air, not from the fire, but from the figures themselves, as if they were feeding it with their presence. Daniel felt his chest tighten, every breath heavier than the last, and a cold sweat broke along his skin despite the searing heat radiating from the flames. One of the figures turned toward him, its face a blur of shifting features, eyes like dark voids pulling him in. His legs trembled, but an unseen force seemed to root him to the sand, making escape impossible. The chanting began again, low and rhythmic, a sound that stirred something primal in his mind, awakening fear older than memory. Slowly, the figures began to raise their arms in unison, pointing directly at him. The fire roared higher, sparks bursting into the air like shards of light, and for a moment Daniel felt the desert itself trembling beneath his feet, as though the earth recognized what would about to awaken. The chanting rose to a deafening pitch, vibrating through Daniel's bones until his teeth ached and his vision blurred. The fire twisted violently, no longer a steady pillar but a spiraling vortex pulling the shadows inward. One by one the figures collapsed into the flames, their forms swallowed without resistance, their voices merging into a single wail that pierced the night. Daniel stumbled back, but the ground beneath him shifted like loose sand, sliding him closer to the vortex. The heat was unbearable, yet he felt an icy chill crawling up his spine, an unnatural contradiction that made his stomach lurch. Then, from the core of the fire, something began to emerge, not a figure of smoke but a towering shape of charred flesh and glowing cracks that pulsed like veins of molten rock. Its hollow eyes fixed on him, and Daniel felt the weight of its gaze press against his chest, crushing the breath from his lungs. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body remained paralyzed, as if the creature's presence had stolen control. The fire dimmed around it, shadows retreating, leaving only Daniel and the monstrous being standing beneath the endless desert sky. The creature stepped forward, its movements heavy and deliberate, each footfall shaking the sand as though the desert itself bowed under its weight. Daniel's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst, his ears ringing with the echo of his own pulse. The being's cracked skin glowed faintly, lines of molten fire running through its body like rivers of lava, casting a sickly light across the dunes. Its hollow eyes never left him, and though its mouth never moved, Daniel heard a voice inside his head, deep and ancient, whispering words he could not understand yet felt burned into his mind. He staggered backward, his shoes sinking into the soft ground, but no matter how far he moved, the distance between them seemed unchanged. Panic clawed at him, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he fought to resist the pull of its presence. The wind howled suddenly, carrying with it the faint cries of distant voices, screams buried in the shifting sands. The creature raised an arm, pointing at him with a finger long and jagged like a broken shard of stone, and the fire behind it flared once more, revealing shapes writhing within the flames as though trapped souls begged for release. Daniel felt the air grow heavier, pressing down on him like an invisible weight, while the cries within the flames grew louder, overlapping until they became a chorus of anguish that rattled his skull. His legs weakened, but some force pulled him closer to the monstrous figure, dragging him step by step despite his desperate resistance. The sand shifted unnaturally, rolling beneath his feet as though alive, guiding him toward the fire where the tortured shapes twisted in endless torment. The creature's gaze bore into him, filling his mind with flashes of barren landscapes, ruins buried under dunes, and men and women wandering aimlessly, their eyes empty, their voices swallowed by the desert wind. The vision seared itself into his memory, leaving him trembling and drenched in sweat. The fire roared higher, and from its core came a sudden surge of energy that whipped through the air like a storm, tossing Daniel onto his knees. His palms sank into the hot sand, burning his skin, but even the pain felt distant compared to the dread settling in his chest. The shadows around him rose again, circling like vultures, and the creature loomed above him, stretching its arms wide, as if demanding something only Daniel could give. The shadows closed in, their forms tightening around Daniel until the firelight was almost blocked from view, leaving him trapped in a suffocating ring of shifting darkness. The creature's presence pressed deeper into his mind, and the whispers grew sharper, turning into words that seemed to claw at his sanity. His heart hammered so loudly he could barely hear himself think, but the message was clear. It wanted him, body and soul, as if he had been brought here for this very purpose. Daniel tried to shout, to fight back, but his voice dissolved. In the air, swallowed by the chanting that erupted once more from the circling shadows. The sand beneath him writhed like a living thing, crawling up his arms, coiling around his legs, trying to bind him in place. The fire pulsed brighter, illuminating countless faces within its flames, each one screaming silently, their eyes filled with despair as they reached toward him. Daniel thrashed, his body straining against the invisible grip, desperation surging through every nerve. The shadows leaned closer, their forms brushing against his skin like icy smoke, and the creature lowered its massive head until its hollow gaze was inches from his own, promising a fate far worse than death. Daniel's body trembled as the creature's hollow gaze bore into him, its presence consuming every corner of his mind. The shadows pressed closer, whispering with voices that didn't belong to the living, their cold touch wrapping tighter around his chest until he could barely breathe. The fire towered higher, roaring like a storm, and in its flames the countless screaming faces turned toward him, stretching their hands outward, begging for him to join them. Panic surged through his veins. Buried within that terror was something else, a spark of defiance. Summoning every ounce of strength left in him, Daniel let out a broken cry and forced himself to resist the pull, fighting against the living sand that tried to swallow him whole. The shadows hissed and recoiled, their forms twisting violently as if burned by his will. The creature leaned closer, cracks along its body splitting wider, spilling molten light that scorched the air. For a moment it seemed unstoppable, but then the desert trembled beneath them. The fire sputtered, collapsing inward, dragging the tortured faces with it as the vortex imploded into silence. The shadows shattered like smoke in the wind, and the monstrous figure let out a guttural roar before dissolving into the night, leaving Daniel alone under the stars. Breathless and trembling, he collapsed onto the cooling sand, the desert around him eerily still once again. The flames, the voices, the cursed figures, everything was gone as though it had never existed. Yet deep inside, Daniel knew the desert had only allowed him to leave, not freed him completely. The memory of what he had witnessed would haunt him for the rest of his life, and Sands would always remember his name. Thank you so much for joining me on this terrifying journey. Your support means everything. Stay safe, stay curious, and until next time, beware of the shadows in the desert.